Hello, this video is to take you through aspects of the plot of An Inspector Calls. By plot, we mean the events of the play, but also how these are sequenced, organised and constructed. So let's imagine that we have this question. Now, this is not a past question from the Edexcel GCSE. It's one I've made up, but I've adopted the same style. So read it through. The telephone rings sharply. Explore the importance of J.B. Priestley's construction of the plot of An Inspector Calls. And as ever, it reminds you that you must refer to context, which is worth 16 marks, and that 8 marks are for vocabulary and spelling, punctuation and grammar. The quotation is really there to nudge you and give you a few ideas. So you might want to take a moment to think about where this quotation comes in the play and how this might connect to ideas about Priestley's construction of the plot. Have a little bit of a brainstorm. Just have a look at this question. Maybe press pause, scribble some ideas down. If this came up, what would you do? So, the telephone has a very important role within the play. It's one of the props that's mentioned in the opening stage directions at the very beginning of the drama. Telephones in 1912 were expensive and they only tended to exist in bourgeois homes. So there is part of the role of the telephone at the very beginning, like the champagne glasses, the decanter of port, is to show status. The Burlings are wealthy enough to own a telephone. However, the telephone subsequently has an important role in the plot of the drama. In a play that has unity of place, we never leave the Burlings' dining room. The telephone represents the link to the outside world. And you might want to think about the telephone calls that come in at the end of the play. Gerald calling the infirmary and saying he's worried about one of their employees at Crofts Limited. Mr. Burling calling Colonel Roberts to see whether there really is an Inspector Gould on the police. But at the end, the telephone rings sharply and it's the police and an inspector's coming to ask some questions. So, one thing perhaps the quotation might have nudged you into thinking is how the ending of this play is managed. But also, the telephone rings sharply is a little bit of an echo of there is a sharp ring at the doorbell from Act 1 when the inspector arrives. And that might also give you some ideas of how the beginning and the ending of the play, in a way, have a number of parallels and similarities. There's mirroring between the two. So, as we've established, there is some mirroring between the beginning and the end. Other examples of that might include the offering of the engagement ring, which Gerald offers to Sheila at the beginning in a kind of very traditional way and offers to her at the end in the hope that, in spite of his infidelity, that she'll take him back. There's also the way that Mrs. Burling speaks about Gerald, which in the middle of the play is in a very condemning way when she finds out that Gerald's had an affair with a prostitute when he was supposed to be, playing court to her daughter. But actually, at the beginning of the play, when Gerald stops Sheila's tears by offering the ring, she says, "That was clever of you, Gerald." And at the ending of the play, "You've argued this very cleverly, Gerald." Once Gerald's put forward his idea that there never was an Eva Smith and it was really 5 different girls. So actually, there's a number of ways in which the beginning and the end connect. Most notably, of course, the idea that an inspector is coming, going to ask some questions. And we've also talked about how, when the plot does seem to be heading towards a resolution, actually, the Burling family begin to connect with the outside world. They begin to try and work out who the inspector really is, but we never really get that resolution that we were perhaps expecting. In the 19th century, I'm just recording something. Hang on, I'll press pause. Finish this and I'll come through. In the 19th century, a literary critic called Gustav Freytag came up with this structure that he claimed typifies how a drama should progress. It's fair to say that Freytag, when he came up with his theory, was mostly thinking about Shakespeare's plays and also of the plays you have from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. It's debatable how far you can apply his model to modern drama. But Freytag claimed that the typical drama should follow this structure. First of all, you have exposition, which is the setting of the scene, the backstory, who's who, what's going on. Then an inciting incident that kind of kicks things off. The rising action, the plot develops, a climax, which is sometimes called a crisis, falling action as, we begin to move towards the ending. And the last stage, the denouement, where you actually, in a sense, get this idea of resolution. The complexity of the plot resolves itself. And denouement is actually the old French word for unknotting. And it's the idea that actually, if the plot was in a big tangle, at the end, it unravels. I mean, if we think about Freytag's model in relation to an inspector calls, it starts in a slightly conventional way. We have the exposition where we understand who Sheila is. She's got engaged to Gerald, what kind of man Mr. Burling is. We gather that Eric's a bit squiffy. Mrs. Burling seems a little bit cold and uptight. Then, of course, we have the ring at the doorbell and the inspector comes and the plot begins to develop with the early questioning. I would argue that the climax of the play comes when Eric realizes that Mrs. Burling, his mother, has turned Eva away and shouts at her, damn you, damn you. And that's a real moment of crisis for the Burling family. Then the falling action, the dialogue that happens once the inspector has left. But then, at the last stage of this, an inspector calls doesn't seem to meet Freytag's model because we don't really get any kind of sense of resolution. In a conventional play, maybe when Gerald offered the ring again, Sheila would have accepted. They'd have poured more champagne and they'd have moved on. But actually, Sheila turns down the ring. There is a ring at the telephone, and an inspector is coming to ask some questions. And instead of ending with this sense of resolution and everything being neatly tied up, we actually end with ambiguity. Who was Inspector Ghoul with his ghostly name? Was he a supernatural figure? Was he, as Mr. Burling claims, a socialist crank who was out to trick them? Is he a symbolic figure of justice and morality? And equally, who was Eva Smith? Is she, as Gerald argues, 5 different girls, all of whom the inspector weaves together to present a narrative? Was she really a single girl called Eva Smith? Or again, is she just a symbol of the working class, of the every woman, as her very common name suggests? So at the end of an inspector calls, we don't really get a traditional denouement. We're actually left with more questions than answers. Something that's very interesting about the plot of an inspector calls is that we get parallel layers of events. Now, first of all, very conventionally, we have the timeline within the events of the play. Aristotle names the concept unity of time, which means that the action is continuous. We don't get a gap of hours or weeks or months. The action, unfolds continuously in front of us. Now, in an inspector calls, we see one character after another placed under scrutiny, beginning with Mr. Burling, followed by Sheila, then Gerald, then Mrs. Burling, and last of all, Eric. And you can therefore see that a character who is perhaps key to the construction of the plot is the inspector. It's his questioning and the order in which the inspector is presented by Priestley to question the Burlings and Gerald that drives the plot forwards, that moves the action forwards. The order, of course, is important because it creates suspense. We know at the very beginning of the play that Eric seems very uneasy that an inspector's calling. we infer that Eric knows something about women. When they're talking about women and clothes, he says, "Yes, I remember," and stops. So Eric clearly has things to hide, but his revelation comes last as we're left guessing as to how bad his involvement is. However, an Inspector Calls very much rests upon the events that the dialogue tells us took place before the action of the play begins. Now, as we've said, you can interpret Inspector Gould as a literal figure, a symbolic figure, or as some kind of supernatural figure. But however we choose to interpret the ending, what the Burlings did clearly does remain the same. Whether it was Eva Smith or not, Mr. Burling sacked a girl after she rebelled against his low wages. It is clear that Sheila did behave that badly in Millwoods. Gerald clearly did meet a sex worker at the Palace Bar, rescued her as he sees it from Alderman Meggerty, but then keeps her as his mistress. In other words, he expects something in return for what he gives to her. Mrs. Burling turns a girl away from charity, and Eric is a thief who has got a girl pregnant. And today we would judge the way he got the girl pregnant very differently from the audience of the late 1940s. So we've got this idea that actually there was a sequence of events before the action of the play begins. At this point, I'd like to bring in genre. What kind of play is an Inspector Calls? And it's really a very interesting play in terms of genre because it, in a sense, conforms partly to many different genres, including, of course, the classic detective story. But there's three genres that I want to touch on very briefly here, and you might want to do more research on these still. Now, first of all, an Inspector Calls is arguably a well-made play. The well-made play is a concept that was first written about by a French writer called Scribe. And well-made plays are highly artificial. They're very tightly constructed. They're not very naturalistic. They tend to be less concerned with depth of characterization than they are with plot and incident. In other words, there's not really psychological depth to them. They tend to be more about what's happening, what's happening, what's happening. One key feature of the well-made play is that very often the key happenings have all taken place before the action of the play begins. Also, with a well-made play, typical features are that letters or papers fall into the wrong hands. And lastly, there is usually a distinct hero who tends to triumph at the end. Now, an Inspector Calls can arguably be termed a well-made play. Most of the action has indeed taken place before the story unfolds in front of us on the stage, as we've just said, these parallel layers of events. It's also true to say that paperwork is involved. The inspector references Eva's diary that he claims to have frequently, and also, of course, shows the photographs. It's probably fair to say that an Inspector Calls is not naturalistic, that it is in many ways much more symbolic and events focused. It's also true to say that it's very, very tightly constructed. That said, there's elements of the well-made play idea to which an Inspector Calls does not conform. The first of those is really the idea of a clear hero or central character who triumphs at the end. I mean, the nearest thing we get to that is probably the inspector, but he's not a hero of a play in a traditional sense. And he's actually someone who we still know very little about at the ending. The other way in which a well-made play could be said to not be what an Inspector Calls is to do with the ending. Going back to Freytag's pyramid, well-made plays tend to follow this very classic structure. As we've already established, an Inspector Calls doesn't. So an Inspector Calls draws on most, but not all, features of the well-made play. In the 19th century, there was a very common genre called the drawing room drama. And they were called that because very often the action took place in one room in a middle or upper class household, and it was very often the drawing room. Now, you can see how Priestley has drawn upon this idea. And in fact, the opening conversation of an Inspector Calls is very like a Victorian drawing room drama. The characters are wealthy, they're in one room, which we never leave. The dialogue isn't particularly deep, it's quite superficial. You might remember the opening dialogue is all about the port and the quality of it. However, I would argue that an Inspector Calls begins as if it's going to follow the model of a drawing room drama, and then it departs from it. These plays tend to be comedies, and Inspector Calls is really, you could argue in many ways, a modern tragedy. Lastly, a very ancient genre is the morality play, which we have in medieval Britain and also, although to a lesser extent, in the Renaissance. Morality plays were not subtle. They were about right and wrong, what is good, what is bad, what is holy, and what is the work of the devil. They very often had abstract figures as characters. So on the good side, you might have God, justice, angel. And on the bad side, you might have greed, um, lust, sloth, devil. And very often there was a character called Everyman who tried to lead the average Christian life and was tempted and had to avoid it. So, morality plays were really very much about what is right and what is wrong and how to lead a good life. Now, of course, An Inspector Calls is a play that was first performed in 1945 and then in Britain in 1946. But in some ways, it is very much the literary descendant of the morality play. You can argue that the inspector is very like the traditional morality play figure of justice. He comes along, he questions, he tells people what they've done wrong, and he delivers judgment with the fire and blood and anguish speech. You can argue that the Burlings represent the traditional seven deadly sins. Eric, with his drinking, represents gluttony. Of course, Eric and Gerald both exhibit lust. Mrs. Burling, pride. Sheila represents envy. Mr. Burling, greed. So you can argue that the Burlings and Gerald very much embody the negative values that morality plays fought against. And that in a way, although Priestley's writing a very modern form, he's perhaps drawing on a very traditional genre. I bring this up because, of course, genre does affect plot. How you decide you're going to put your plot together does depend on what kind of play you think you're writing. Just as today, an action movie is put together in a very different way from a film about romance. So, if you were to ever have an essay on plot, you might want to think about these terms and bring them in, even if it's only in an introduction or a conclusion, and explore the ways in which those genres have influenced the decision Priestley makes about the events and the ordering of them. So, let's go back to the question that I began with. The telephone rings sharply. Explore the importance of J.B. Priestley's construction of the plot of An Inspector Calls. You must refer to the context of the play in your answer. I'm going to talk you through a possible essay plan that you could use on this question. Obviously, this is only a plan. Were I to write the essay, I'd elaborate on all these ideas in greater depth. So, in my introduction, I could introduce the idea that in this well-made play, Priestley uses both intense, continuous happenings and references to events that took place before the action of the play commences. So, going back to the idea that we've got multiple layers of events. Now, then, in my first paragraph, I thought I could bring in the idea of judgment. And in a way, the judgment that Priestley is asking the 1945-1946 audience to, how he's inviting them to judge and condemn the behaviour of the Burlings and Gerald and what they represent. everything that we hear about the Burlings in the last couple of years suggests that this is a family that has exploited the vulnerable, whether it's been for sex, whether it's been, in a sense, for pride, whether it's been out of jealousy, whether it's been for the greed and not wanting to pay higher wages. So I could explore those ideas, adding in suitable quotations. And for context, which is worth 16 marks, I could link in different places in my paragraph Priestley's socialist views and perhaps bring in how Priestley's traumatic experiences in World War One, when he was gassed, when he was temporarily buried alive after the trench he was in had a shell explode nearby, how he came out of World War One wanting a better and fairer future. So, if my first paragraph is on judgment, then I could really look at the way in which the beginning and the ending of the play reflect each other. So, through mirroring the ending and the beginning and incorporating elements of the morality play, now that's some literary context. Sorry, excuse me. Priestley suggests that the capitalist characters fail to learn the inspector's moral lesson. So, in other words, at the beginning, they're all terribly pleased with themselves. And actually, although they suffer while he questions them, apart from Eric and Sheila, they're all terribly pleased with themselves at the end. And then we have this idea of the second coming and the final judgment. So I could also bring in here that Priestley subverts the traditional idea of a plot having a denouement and a neat resolution, and the way in which that by avoiding this very traditional expected resolution, Priestley creates a sense of discomfort in the audience of 1945 to 6. So here my context is really discussing the morality play, which is literary context, and also the 1945 to 6, post World War II context of production. Then I thought I would move on to the role of the inspector. So through the intensity of the inspector's questioning of a sequence of characters, Priestley creates heightened tension. And of course, he's promoting his agenda of social responsibility. So, for example, why are they questioned in that order? It clearly, in a sense, forms a chronology of Eva Smith's life, if Eva Smith ever did really exist at all. But we've also got, of course, the way that suspense is created, with Eric, for example. Now, my obvious context here is the vulnerability of working class women in 1912 and working in ideas about gender and class in the Edwardian period. Now, lastly, I decided to focus on different layers of events and also on the concept of the 1912 setting and the way that the plot is constructed so that Priestley's able to use dramatic irony to expose the cruelty, as he sees it as a socialist, of capitalist values. And my context here is the events between 1912 and 1945, including, of course, both world wars, the general strike and other labour troubles, the Russian Revolution, the Titanic sinking, and the Great Depression. Now, in my conclusion, I thought I would mention that Priestley constructed the plot with care, that we begin with, this superficial play that seems to have the conventions of the drawing room drama, but ultimately, Priestley chooses to enter his play with that deliberate lack of resolution. Through forcing the Burlings in close sequence, so that's plot, to confess to their past sins, the author demonstrates his view that British society needs to become more caring and socially responsible. Now, the question was, what is the importance of the construction of the plot? And you can see that in that conclusion, I very much answered that question. I've looked at, for example, the lack of resolution, the parallel layers of events, the very careful and artificial construction of the plot, and the way in which throughout J.B. Priestley is promoting his political and social agenda. So there we go. There are other paragraphs that you could do instead of the ones that I've outlined, but that would be a way of making an essay on the importance of the construction of the plot work. Just to finish, you can press pause on this and think about it. Again, this isn't a past question from Edexcel. This is one that I've made up. But something you could do as a revision exercise is have a look at this alternative question. Now, something you have to be really careful of in a GCSE exam is sometimes you might, in a way, be really lucky, and a question might come up that's really similar to one that you've been set in class or for homework. And you might remember lots of it and think, brilliant, I can remember all this, off I go. But of course, you have to be really careful because sometimes questions are similar, but they're not identical. And in this case, it's the importance of J.B. Priestley's presentation of plot elements that take place before the action of an inspector calls. In other words, what Mr. Burling did, what Sheila did, what Gerald did, and so on and so on. What's the importance of that, the past of the characters, and how it links to the way that the plot is sequenced as the action of the play moves forwards? So, a good revision exercise would be to press pause and to spend 5 minutes looking at this question and thinking, okay, how would I respond to this? And some of the points I've made in this alternative essay will be relevant, but not identical, and you will need to slant your answer differently. Okay, thank you very much. I hope that's given you some useful ideas of what you could include if you ever are asked about plot in an inspector calls. One more thing, plot essays can be a little bit hard to spot because the exam board doesn't have to use the word plot. So if you see a question that is using words like sequencing, events, order of occurrences, take a pause and think, because that is likely to be a plot question in disguise. Okay, everybody, thank you very much. Bye bye.